quitting the ministry, walking away, just saying, I've had enough. And they all say the same thing in essence, though the words may be different. It all boils down to words, something like one I received not too long ago. I was diligent, I was faithful, I gave my best, but the harder I tried, the less results I saw. My congregation was not appreciative. My prayers seemed to be in vain. I got to the place where what I preached seems like so much phoniness because it was not working in my own life and ministry. My prayers, my tears, my faith, my spiritual warfare, nothing seemed to get results. I'm going to have to quit the ministry till I figure this out. And folks, watching over the years, those I've met, those I know, and the reports I get, most of those who quit very seldom come back. They have this peeve against God. I did everything supposedly right and things didn't turn out for me. They get this thought, first of all anger against God starts with a question, why? Why did you allow this when all I wanted to do was give myself? And things turned and things changed and I don't understand it. God doesn't seem to answer my prayers anymore. They turn to materialism. Most of them backslide. Never preach again, and very, very seldom do they get back. Now, this past week, someone had sent us a book, and I just sat down. I couldn't put it down. I read the whole book through, and I read fast. In 2 hours, I just finished the book. It's a missionary story about Aggie. The name of the book is Aggie. And if you'll pardon me, I would like to go into some detail about Aggie's story because it best illustrates what I'm trying to talk to you about, the anger of God that so many Christians have in their hearts now. This is an amazing story that just gripped my heart. In 1921, there were two couples in a famous church in Stockholm, at the Philadelphia Pentecostal Church in Stockholm. I preached there years ago. And it was a great missionary church, and they sent out young couples all over the world. And in one particular missionary service, two young couples heard the call of God to go into Belgian Congo in Africa. David Flood and his wife Sevilla, and along with them Bertha and Joel Erickson. They packed everything, sold everything, and headed down to the Belgian Congo. And when they got there, they felt they would leave the main mission station, and with machetes and whatever they had, they would hack their way into villages. And with great zeal, ready to be martyrs, young prayer warriors. Now, Sevilla was David Flood's wife was only 4 feet 8 inches high. She'd been a rather famous singer in Sweden. But had this call, and David and Sevilla had a little boy, a little 2-year-old son, and they put him on his back and they carried him, went miles into the interior of Belgian Congo, which is now Zaire, and the language was Swahili. And after weeks of hacking and pushing their way through the jungle, and in the process of making their way, they all contracted malaria. Sick and diseased, they finally came upon a village and were totally rejected. They said, we don't want any of the whites here because our gods will be offended, and pushed them out of the village. Found their way after a day or two to another village and were rejected again. Everywhere they went, nobody would have them near. So they said there's nothing else to do but settle down. They went onto a mountaintop in the jungle and hacked out an area and made some mud huts. Mr. Erickson, Joel Erickson, after about 6 months of malnutrition and pain and suffering and fever, said, I've had enough. He and his wife Bertha said, we're going back to the main mission station. And this was probably 100 miles away, and they had to hike their way back. They said goodbye to David Flood and his wife Sevilla. And David said, I can't go. Sevilla just told me she's pregnant. She had malaria. She won't be able to make the trip back to the station. And besides, I want my child born here in Africa. I've come to give my life to Africa. Savea for 3 months for about 2 or 3 months was in a raging fever. There was nothing but malnutrition. But in the meantime, even with her burning fever, she ministered to a little boy. The only convert they had was a little boy who came from one of the local villages. He really gave his heart to Jesus, and he'd come every day with some kind of fruit and smile. And Savea, her whole life was wrapped up in that one little convert. She just ministered to him. She gave birth to a little girl. And within a week, she was at the point of death. And just before Savea died, she whispered to David Flood, call her name Aina. A-I-N-A. And then she died. David Flood made a wooden box, and in a primitive grave on that mountain, he dug a hole and buried. But as he stood there, looking at his little boy and heard the cry of the baby in a mud hut, an anger, a bitterness began to well up in David Flood's heart. He said, God, you have failed me. What a waste of life. He looked at the little casket, he put a little wooden cross. He said, she was a singer. She gave her life. We've been here 1.5 years, and all we have to show for it is one little boy who probably doesn't understand it anyhow. And anger rose up in his heart. He said, God, is this how you treat your servants who are ready to give their very lives? And he couldn't control his anger. It broke out into a rage. And in a rage, he took got his few belongings, took little David and little Aina into the village where they made a little hammock to carry her, and hired some of the men, and went back to the main mission station about 100 miles away, and stopped at villages where village women would breastfeed the little girl, because it was such a novelty to see a little white girl they'd never seen before. They got to the mission station, and the Ericksons were there. They had left months before. And David said, I'm going home. I'm losing my eyesight. I've lost my wife. I can't handle even my little boy, let alone a little girl. And he turned his daughter over to the Ericksons and gave her away, and headed for the shore and got on a boat back to Sweden, back to Stockholm. And all the way back to Stockholm, he stood on the deck of the boat, just seething against God. He had told the people he was going to Africa to be a martyr, to win them one by one, no matter what the cost. He'd said goodbye, and now he's coming home defeated and broken, because he said, God failed me. God has not answered my prayer. God is not faithful. Winds back in Stockholm and decides to go into the import business and make all the money, make a fortune, and live high. He said, I don't want to hear the name of God again. And he turned to drink alcohol, became an alcoholic, would not allow anybody to ever mention God's name in his presence. He would go into a rage, his neck would stick out, the veins, in anger. Don't talk to me about God. God is not there. He failed me. The Ericksons, within a year, were both poisoned at the mission compound by a local chief. They both died. Little Aina was handed over to the Bergs. I knew the Bergs. This is a true story. In fact, I know all the characters in this story. And David and Anna Berg took her up to Masia, up into northern Congo, which is now Zaire, and for about 5 years. They called her Aggie. They changed her name to Aggie. Aggie played with these wonderful little Congo children, learned Swahili language. But then they finally decided to go on furlough because they were afraid David Flood might come back and take her. They went to America and traveled throughout around Minneapolis area. Little girl Aggie grew up just in an imaginary world because she didn't understand English. It took her a long time to adjust because she couldn't even wear shoes. She never had worn shoes. She just played bare feet in the jungle with the children. And so she was an oddity. Everybody talked about this girl had been given away and became a spectacle. So she imagined in her mind. She played games, imagination games, alone in her room. She imagined she had 4 brothers and a sister. And she would imagine her sister looking for her. And she gave names to these imaginary brothers. And she would play games and set a little table there and talk to her brothers and her sister, not knowing that David Flood had remarried Sevilla's youngest sister, which was a tragedy because she had no heart for God. But she'd given birth to 4 sons and a daughter, and she didn't know it. In imagination, she played these games. She wrote during the years trying to find her father, for years wanting to meet father. She married Dewey Hurst. And Dewey Hurst eventually became president of Northwest Assembly of God Bible School. I knew Dewey and had met Aggie, but I didn't know her story. 40 years go by. David Flood was, of course, an alcoholic, cursing God. His eyesight failing. And after 40 years of trying and struggling, the Bible school gave them both a round-trip ticket to Stockholm, to Sweden. And on the way to Sweden, they had a layover for a day in London, and they decided to take a walk. They walked past Royal Albert Hall. I've preached there also. I know the scene. And there was a missions convention, Pentecostal Assembly of God missions convention. And they just stood out in the lobby, and suddenly a young black preacher stood up and began to tell of what God was doing in the Belgian Congo. And her heart leaped. There was something about the man. And she said, I've got to go back. She took her husband, made her way back through the crowd, and the man was standing there. And she went up to him and said, do you remember a missionary by the name of Sevilla and David Flood? He said, yes. Sevilla Flood led me to the Lord. And she said, he said, there was a little girl born, but I don't know what happened to her. She said, I'm Aggie. He took her in his hands and almost screamed. He said, do you understand? Did you hear what I said tonight? This little boy grew up to be one of the finest evangelist missionaries. 110,000 Christians in the Belgian Congo under his care. A hospital, schools, 32 schools, Bible schools. She said, your mother led me to the Lord. Of course, Sevilla was overwhelmed. Next day they went to Stockholm. Word had got that she was coming. She had found out by now that she had brothers and a sister. She had already found that out. She got from the airport, went into the hotel lobby, and there were 3 brothers standing there, and they made themselves all known to her. She said, where's David? Now, she had pictured her brother who'd been in Africa. She pictured him as a tall, handsome man like her father. And they pointed to a chair, and there's a gray-haired man, shriveled. Said, that's David. David, too, had become an alcoholic. This boy, 2-year-old son, that David Flood had brought, he had destroyed. None of these boys, not any of them had talked to their father in years. They were angry at him. Said, you can't talk about God, he curses. And they said, well, I have a sister, don't I? And she got on the phone and called her sister, and her sister, the phone went dead. And she couldn't figure it out. And then suddenly, her sister came into the lobby. She says, what happened? She says, when I found your name, I dropped the phone and dressed and came. She said, all my life I've dreamed about you. She said, I would get a world map and I have a little car and I'd pretend to drive to find you. They were reunited. The daughter hated her. The other girl hated her father, David Flood, despised him. But she said, we are going to find him, and we're going there. We're going now. And they got in a car to a low caste area of Stockholm, very poor area of Stockholm, up the dirty stairs into a second floor, knocked on the door. A rather rotund lady opened the door, and Aggie looked in, and there over in the corner, there were alcohol bottles everywhere, empty alcohol bottles. And over in a corner, in a cot, was her father, David Flood, 73 years old, diabetes, a stroke, and cataracts on both eyes. That missionary with an anger against God. She goes and falls at his side and says, Dad, I'm your little girl you gave away in Africa. And he turned and looked at her, and tears began to flow down his cheeks. He says, honey, I never meant to give you away. I couldn't handle it. She said, Daddy, that's okay. God took care of me. And he began to rage. He says, God didn't take care of you. God failed us. God ruined our family. All we got out of it was a little boy who didn't even understand a word of it. And then she opened up the whole story. She said, Daddy, that little boy became one of Africa's great missionaries. Told the whole story. And he said, you're just telling me a story. He said, no, it's true. It's in the newspapers. It's everywhere now. Everybody knows about that boy. Tears began to flow down his eyes. And suddenly the Holy Spirit came upon David Flood. And the Lord restored him. The Lord restored David Flood.